important given the early contact events at the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, CSETI.org, has been having, that we should go to England to investigate if, in fact, there was an extraterrestrial connection to the crop circles, and if indeed they were under some kind of conscious manifestation as opposed to some natural phenomenon. He had already concluded in the late 1980s, I think in 1989, that in fact they were not man-made, at least not all of them, and that there was some intelligence behind them that was really quite profound. And so Colin Andrews, who had done some magnificent research and continues to do magnificent research in the area, inspired us to go over there and do an expedition. So we went over in 1992 to the area around in Wiltshire, the county of Wiltshire in England, which is kind of west-southwest of London, I believe, and it's very famous for having some of the ancient monolithic sites such as Stonehenge and Avebury, Silbury Hill, and a number of other remarkable ancient areas. And we were in an area right near Alton Barnes, which was the location of some of the most spectacular crop circle formations of 1991 and 92. And so we were on a farm in 1992 at Alton Barnes, and it's actually the same one we're going to be using this year. We're going over there with a group, a research group, and it's about an 1,800-acre estate that has wheat and other crops grown on it, and it's in an area where Woodborough Hill, if you get on a map, you'll see that there's a site called Woodborough Hill that's sort of surrounded by this huge 1,800-acre farm. And so we went there with a relatively small group of people, and on one of the nights we decided that to do an experiment in consciousness, and this would be something that I think World Puja Network listeners would be interested in, because it's all about higher states of consciousness when you start talking about pujas and the Vedas. And so we went to up on Woodborough Hill and decided once we arrived on site that we would contact the extraterrestrial civilizations that we felt were behind the authentic crop circles that were appearing, and transmit to them a specific form. And the form that we ended up projecting is now the CSETI logo. If you get on the CSETI.org site, you'll see a whole report on this, by the way. And it is three circles made into an equilateral triangle connected by lines between the circles. And that was what we had decided we would send to the ETs using remote viewing and higher states of consciousness by connecting to the extraterrestrial civilizations and the spacecraft that had been seen in the area, and ask them if they would please make exactly that form in a crop circle, in a field, while we were there. And so we did our protocols where we sat in a circle together and did a meditation using the mantras and using the remote viewing techniques that we've developed. And we then connected to the ETs and showed them this perfect equilateral triangle consisting of three circles connected by lines. And then we continued to do a number of other contact protocols, and we saw a number of ET craft very fast moving across the area, which we later found had in fact been filmed by people who were on some of the hillsides around us. In Golden Ball Hill, there was an object seen, and a number of other sites. Well, Sherry Adamek, who at that time was working very closely with me and had gotten involved in 1991 in the project, and I were a couple of days later ran into a gentleman who had been an intelligence agent with the government of England, and who had retired but had a strong interest in what was going on with this phenomenon. And we ran into this gentleman, and he had been keeping a logbook, and he had just come from a new crop circle, and he had opened his book, and he had a drawing of it, and it was exactly, precisely the form that we had projected mentally to the ETs and asked them to make a crop circle in that form, what is now the C-SETI triangle. And when Sherry and I looked at it, we virtually burst into tears. We could not believe what we were seeing. And we asked this man, I believe his name was Ralph Noyes, and I said, where is this? And he says, well, it's over at Oliver's Castle. And, of course, I was visualizing a big old British castle. And Oliver's Castle, as it turns out, is actually a cliff. And it's a geological formation, and at the base of which is a farm. And it was not far at all from where we had been doing our contact work the night that we sent this shape out to the ETs. And so Sherry and I raced over there at 100 miles per hour, I mean literally, and climbed up onto this, drove up and walked out to the edge of this cliff where we could look down onto this farm. And there in the field was precisely and exactly the shape that the 12 of us or so who were up on Woodborough Hill that night had projected up to the ETs, the crop circle makers. And it was in a field that was not at all far from where we had been doing this work. Now, no one else in England or in the world knew that this is what we had projected, and it appeared the very night, the wee hours of the morning, that we had done the CE5 where we asked the ETs to make this form. So no one knew about it. It wasn't like this was advertised or public. In fact, we didn't even decide on what this form and shape would be until we got out there very late that night. And the farmer found it in the wee hours of the morning, maybe at 4 or 5 in the morning, because he was trying to harvest some of his field during some dry weather. And there it was. And it was as if it had been lifted from our consciousness and our mind and placed in the field. Well, this is when we realized, my God, this is a truly interactive phenomenon where there is a connection between the ETs that are involved in this mysterious crop circle phenomenon and human consciousness, if you understand the science of consciousness. So that was how all of that started. It was a very, very exciting. Now, on that same expedition in '92, a couple of days later, it had been really terrible weather. In the evening, suddenly a rainstorm came up on us, and we were in a field at the base of Woodborough Hill at this point where there was a crop circle that had appeared about the time that we landed in England on this particular year, '92. And a lot of people felt it was a very strange kind of storm because as we were sitting in the field, we noticed that from above there were these lights circling counterclockwise on the clouds, swirling counterclockwise, but not from below, like you'd have a searchlight, but from above, because there was no source from the ground. And you could see they were coming from above, shining down in the cloud, and they were swirling around counterclockwise. And we all saw this. And a few moments later, it just rained cats and dogs, unbelievable, right over this farm. So Colin Andrews, who had been out there, he left, as did a whole lot of other people. And it just poured so hard. Now, what Colin Andrews told us is that as he left, as soon as he touched the road and went off of the farm, there was no rain. So there was, I believe, an extraterrestrially created rainstorm right over this 1,800-acre estate. And the reason for it was because when word of that crop circle that looked like the C-SETI triangle logo leaked out, we started having a lot of people spying on what we were doing. And the ETs were, I think, concerned about this for some reason. I mean, there may have been some elements that were there. And so this rainstorm caused everyone to think, oh, well, there's nothing going to happen tonight, and everybody went home. Well, myself and about 3 other people stayed out there in the pouring rain. We got back in our vehicles, and there was a little road in this farm that was actually paved, concrete, but it was like a one-lane farm road in the center of this 1,800-acre estate, and had a little pull-out, and there were two cars that remained, my car and then another gentleman's car, Chris Mansell. And we pulled out there. We decided to sit in the cars on the edge of this field and just wait for the worst of this to get over, because it was getting cold and wet. But my intuition, I was being told repeatedly, later, that something would happen later. So we didn't leave. And so we remained there. I will remark that as Colin Andrews was leaving, we saw a red orb appear at the back of his car, as if it was following him out. Now, interestingly, after a while, it was probably after midnight. I have to look at my notes. And suddenly there was a banging on my window of the car, and it was Chris Mansell, and he'd come out and he'd said, so I rolled the window down. This was a car that didn't have electric windows, so I had the old hand crank, and you never see these in cars anymore, except maybe in Europe. But so I cranked it down, and he was there saying, he says, there's a spacecraft in the field lit up like a bloody Christmas tree. And, of course, he was a big jokester, and I just chuckled, and I said, yeah, and I'm Santa Claus. And he says, no, it's here. And he stepped aside, and I looked right beside him, and about 10 feet above the field, in the field that we were in, was about a 100-foot diameter disc that was fully materialized, rotating counterclockwise, just like the lights had been that created this rainstorm, in the field. And I mean, we're not talking miles away or even hundreds of yards away. We're talking a few hundred feet away. So I got out of the vehicle immediately, and I said, oh, my God, they're here. And this was the most beautiful thing, because it was counterclockwise in how it turned, but the lights that were around the edge of it were these multicolored red and white and amber, and they sort of bled into each other. So they were going both directions, left and right, sort of bleeding into each other in the most beautiful formation of lights. And then it came up to sort of a cone on top, and then there was a set of amber lights on the very top of this disc. This was very, very clear, even though at this point it wasn't pouring rain. It was just sort of misty and drizzly and very British weather. And so we got out, and I turned to, there was a woman with me who was from the United States, who was a PhD psychologist, and I said, look, we need to signal to this craft and let them know that we see them now and invite them to come closer. And she says, we're going to do what? And I said, well, we're going to invite them to come closer for contact. And she refused to get the light. We had those times we didn't have the lasers we use now. We had these big high-powered lights. She says, no, I can't. And it turned out that she was just absolutely terrified. And because I said, well, what do you think we're doing here? And she said, well, I thought maybe we'd see something at some great distance. I didn't expect one to be right here in the field with us, fully materialized. I said, well, that's why we're doing this. We're here to make contact and create an open relationship between humanity and these extraterrestrial civilizations. And she says, oh, no, we can't. And so it was a very interesting sort of dynamic, because this had been someone who had been very flip about the idea of making contact before this event happened. And at this time, back in the early 90s, I was not doing trainings for people where I would spend a week with them, teaching them meditation techniques and higher states of consciousness and the whole philosophy behind the contact and the techniques. I just thought, well, people go out and do this and everyone would be ready for it. Well, everyone isn't ready for it, no matter what they may say intellectually. There's a sort of a bypass around their intellect, that people will intellectualize these things and won't really check in with if they're really ready for something like this. So I realized that. Now, one of the things in her defense, I will say, is that this object was materialized fully, meaning that it was in linear space-time, three-dimensional. And the craft was close enough that it was causing an electrostatic discharge, so that all the hair was standing up on our bodies. In other words, it's sort of an electrostatic field, and the power lines that were on the farm had this buzzing to them. which was a result of this electromagnetic energy field, because these ET spacecraft create enormous gigawatts of electricity. They're not running on fossil fuels or nuclear power plant. They're running on these transdimensional electromagnetic systems that generate enormous amounts of electrical discharge and alter space-time, and can also have an effect on consciousness because of that, which is another discussion we can get into. Well, then I put my compass out, and the compass was moving counterclockwise around the dial very slowly as the craft was moving counterclockwise. So the magnetic field change was so profound that this compass was literally moving off magnetic north, and but slowly. It wasn't spinning quickly, but slowly rotating around, like this entire magnetic field around us was shifting counterclockwise. So all of this phenomenon was going on, and this one particular person became totally unglued. And at that point, now this craft started coming closer, because I was inviting it to come closer, and it was gliding in the field closer and closer and closer. And as it did so, of course, this phenomenon of electrostatic discharge and the magnetic field changing and the hair standing on the end because of the electrostatic field around us was increasing. And this woman became so disturbed that at that point the ET sensed her fear and stopped. And I always tell people this is how you can tell the difference between a covert human alien reproduction vehicle that have these fake ETs on them that are doing all the abductions and the real ETs. The real ETs never push into your space to where you're afraid that much. And so she became so afraid that she stopped. The craft stopped, and then it slowly backed off and then rose and went into this mist, because it was a very misty night, and looked like it disappeared, but I knew it was up in the clouds above us because my compass continued to go around the dial counterclockwise for an entire hour until it made a complete 360-degree movement. And at that point, exactly at that point, the clouds opened up right above us, and there was an amber-colored disk up in the sky, some few thousand feet away, some safe distance, at least for this woman. They knew that she would be okay with that, and we signaled to it with our lights, and it signaled back, and then it vanished and just disappeared in the sky. It was a beautiful, beautiful encounter, and there were many lessons in this. Number one, they can create an environmental situation like this rainstorm to secure an area, and they have done this. Linda and I have seen this happen many times. Number two, they are sensitive to people being afraid. And if they sense that fear from people, if people aren't really ready for contact, they will keep a certain distance because they don't want to create that kind of psychic violence or trauma. And number three, they can then move into a modality where they can be at some distance where everyone who is on site is comfortable. And number four, that the electromagnetic effects of these craft, when they're fully materialized in our linear space-time, is enormous, enough to move magnetic field to where a compass is moving counterclockwise with the rotation of the ship. So there are a number of things that happen, but these are just a few of the things that happened right away as we went there. So this is something that I really wanted to share as our first expedition to England, and that this is what happened. And there were more things that happened that year, but those are the real highlights of it. And so when you get on the cseti.org website, you'll see the logo is a equilateral triangle, and that comes from this crop circle that we transmitted in consciousness to the ETs, and that they made that very night, the first night we were out, or one of the early nights that we were out there that week. So it was a very, very gratifying and exciting beginning to our